Welcome back to the Budget Archive. My name is Mitch. With RDO just around the corner, now is the perfect time to pick up cards to your deck. Here are my top 10 budget picks to improve consistency and keep you competitive on the battlefield. Starting us off at number 10, we have a Null Spell. Interaction is hugely important in Pantheon, and a Null Spell being a norm card means it's going to slot into a majority of decks. It's got the level 2 reduction, meaning it's going to cost 2 most of the time. And with Pantheon being primarily a level 3 format, there's not going to be too many decks you're not going to want this in. Being able to just stop your opponent's most important spell is going to be a game changer for you a lot of the time. And quite often if you're not playing a Cleric or a Water deck, your opponent's not going to expect you to have counters like this. In number 9, we have Terraforming and Safeguard Amulet. Being able to stop yourself from dying in certain situations is always important. However, something like Terraforming can be hugely important in some situations where it not only can be used to save yourself, but it can be used as a bargaining piece with your other opponents in order to negotiate some sort of truce to mean that you're going to crack this on a certain opponent's turn, effectively giving you an advantage as well as getting something out of one of your opponents at the same time. Number 8, we've got Raise the Land and Expel Departed. Removal in Pantheon is key. Always make sure you've got a certain amount of removal within the deck, and you're going to find that domains and fantasias are quite often very prevalent in the games. A lot of the more powerful cards that are going to affect the whole game state are going to be one of these two, so I definitely recommend putting both these into any Pantheon deck you build. Number 7, we've got the Bbles. So with Pantheon being a 4-player game, you're quite often going to have multiple elements around the table, if not every element around the table. That is unless your playgroup's no fun. Quite often you're going to mean that you're going to be able to crack at least 2 if not 3 of these every game. So if you are trying to build the cheapest possible deck you can build, or just you don't have access to a lot of the more expensive regalia, then these are a great option to slot in, just being an extra draw throughout the game. Number 6, this list was meant to be just generic cards that can fit into every deck. However, I couldn't pass up Crave Shock, Fairy Whispers, and Lost in Thought. Hence why these are all in the same slot, because they are perfect staples to put into their specific elements. Crave Shock is a great draw in discarding flow memory and just sifting through your deck to find the cards that you want. Fairy Whisper is pretty much the same, being able to look through your deck and get something out that you need, as well as put away stuff that you don't need to the bottom. You do have to run quite a high win count in Fairy Whispers, however, depending on your deck, that's probably not going to be a problem. Lost in Thought, you're generally only going to want to run this when you run a lot of floating memory, but most water decks are going to be running a hefty amount of floating memory, so you're generally not going to have a problem, especially if you can just pay 2 or 3 for this to draw 2 or 3 cards late game. It's going to be an absolute game changer, giving you the influence required to possibly win the game. We then have the sweeps. Flame Sweep, Hurricane Sweep, and Tidal Sweep. Now, these are Warrior class bonus locked. However, a lot of decks in this game do get to high influence because you go for so long, and there's quite often turns where you don't really do much. And quite often you can end up with board states where one opponent just has a huge board, and they're effectively just waiting to be able to attack everyone at the same time and kill them. So being able to bring out a sweep out of nowhere, because the cleave is not class bonus locked, it can quite often be a good option to have in the deck, just in order to wipe your opponent's board if you're using something like a sword or polearm or just some sort of weapon to give it a bit of bonus damage. So it's definitely something I'd look into if you're having problems with ally boards. We then have Escape the Wreckage. This is probably one of the most key cards, I'd say, to put into a majority of decks as long as you're running allies. If you aren't running allies, of course you're not going to really want this in the deck because there's not going to be anything for you to save and you're not going to get drawn to memory. However, because Pantheon is a singleton format, a lot of the allies you get, especially the utility allies, are going to be one use. You get the effect of them, the on-enter effect, the on-foster effect, of whatever effect it is, you're only going to get it once. However, having Escape the Wreckage available to you to then bring it back to your memory, be able to play it out again and to get that effect again, can be hugely powerful. We then have Unbroken Mustang. Same as the removal with the Fantasia and Domain removal, Regalia can be a huge problem in this game, and being able to remove them is sometimes key. Now, we do have a high influence as mentioned, so quite often the 4 cost of Mustang isn't going to be too huge of a problem. And the main thing you're going to be running this over other removal for is the fact that it is a unit, it's an ally. So it's not going to be able to be countered by anything that counters actions or spell cards, which is going to be a majority of the interaction within Pantheon decks. So it's a good option in order to remove something that's being a bit pesky to you, and then also getting a 1/2 ally on board, allowing you to get some chip damage or attack damage in. Bascure. Bascure is normally one of those cards that people look at and go, oh yeah, it's okay in a level 3 deck, but it's, you know, what. But being a 2 cost with floating memory that also heals you 4 is pretty huge in Pantheon. Of course, the games go long, you're quite often ticking up chip damage, you're not generally taking huge amounts of damage early on like in a standard game. And because this is target opponent's influence is greater than yours for cover 4, quite often one of your opponents is going to be a greater influence than you. It's very rare you're going to be the highest influence player on the field, and if you are, you probably aren't too worried about having to recover 4. However, this is one of those cards that if you're trying to build a budget deck, I definitely recommend putting this in. And if you're running a deck that wants to keep its life total down quite a bit, I'd just say chuck this in anyway, even if it is a competitive version. Finally, Gentle Respite. This is probably the most key card I'd say to have in any Pantheon deck. With the new rules of all the spirits coming out at the same time, everyone drawing their hands, if you're going first, second, or third, being able to play this off the bat, you're generally going to be able to draw a card. It's going to be very few and far between where your opponent is going to try and interact with you and stop you from drawing that card because they're not going to get to recollect. And quite often you can end up in situations where you've got an opponent on the field that you know is not going to have fast speed interaction right now, or you know they're not going to want to do anything and risk not being able to recollect. So this is probably one of the best turn 1 plays in Pantheon. So I definitely recommend picking up one of these if you haven't already. And that's my top 10. Make sure to let me know down below if there were cards on here you don't think deserve to be on here, and what should replace them if they were to be removed. Make sure to like and subscribe, and check out my other videos. Until next time, stay safe.